Hi, this is Kit Bradley with Writerly Talk, and today I'm going to talk about something lighter because honestly, lockdown is starting to mess with my head. I want to talk about vampires versus werewolves. In particular, how it is that werewolves have gotten the fuzzy end of the stick. I mean, how did vampires get cooler than werewolves? It doesn't make any sense to me. Theories, supernatural fiction, vampires are on top. It's true in TV shows and movies too. Vampires are presented almost uniformly superior in all ways to werewolves, physically, magically, holding more wealth and social status. Since I write horror, I've done research into both of them, and honestly, as horror monsters, they come from the same dreams and nightmares. In most ways, too, the differences between them are notional. They're bloodthirsty cannibal monsters who kill without remorse. They're witches or wizards who made dark pacts for power to live without civilization or consequence. They changed the shape of familiars of the devil. This is a metaphor for the unchecked rapacity of aristocracy. You know, the Giles Raises and Elizabeth Bathory's of the world, or maybe just all those let them eat cake asshole the French decided didn't need their heads. Alternately, vampires and werewolves were cursed, either through chance or because some evil deed they committed. Often suicide, but another favorite is crossing a witch. They were miserable creatures, either damned without a soul or prey to evil magic. In both cases, their condition can be transmitted with a bite. This is, obviously to me, metaphorical of communicable diseases and extreme cases of mental illness. With werewolves and vampires, you're either a sorcerer making a pact with Satan, or you're cursed. Even in the 20th century, the categories are vague. More than one vampire can turn into a wolf, which is virtually the definitive ability of a werewolf. The heightened distinction is, I think, Hollywood's fault. In the creature features of the early to mid 20th century, Dracula has this raft of supernatural abilities, whereas the werewolf, Larry Talbot, is just cursed. They represent the two different forks in the folklore. Dracula is the willing servant of evil. He's a sorcerer who trades his soul for power. Talbot is the hapless victim of a curse. He's just a dude who was bitten, though to keep with the witchy theme, the werewolf that bit him was the son of a gypsy soothsayer, which is to say, a witch. At any event, he's the victim. Dracula revels in his power. He kills and seduces and tortures and maims with abandon. He occasionally feels remorse, but the moments pass quickly and he's back at it again. Talbot, on the other hand, hates his condition and dreads his transformation. Wanting to be rid of his curse is his defining characteristic. There were no early werewolf movies where the character embraced their conditions, where they were the sorcerer who traded the wolf skin to the devil at midnight on the full moon and were granted immortality and superhuman powers, but gave up their immortal soul and lusted for human flesh. It didn't happen in Hollywood, but it did happen repeatedly over large sections of the earth for centuries of time. The werewolf, as you understand it, evolved. Before the werewolf was a monster, they were heroes, like old school heroes. They were servants of Odin, the Ilfhednir, a kind of berserker who wore wolf skins into battle. In the throes of the fight, they had invulnerability to fire and weapons combined with inhuman strength and savagery. Or as the Ylinga saga puts it, they went armorless into battle and were as crazed as dogs or wolf and as strong as bears or boars. They bit their shields and slew men, while they themselves were neither harmed by fire nor iron. Or they're like the Celtic hero Cuchulainn, whose Rheastrada turned him into a monster that knew neither friend nor foe. And not for nothing, Cuchulainn's name means the Hound of Culainn. In his warp spasm, Cuchulainn was the uncivilized precursor to the Crown of Culainn, bestial and untamed, dangerous to everyone, as a wolf is to a hound. My favorite case is the Grand Prince of Polotsk, Veslav the Sorcerer, who is a werewolf magician who used the form of a werewolf to get shit done. Or as it is said in the tale of Igor's campaign, he with wiles at the last tore himself free and galloped as a wolf to the city of Kiev. With his weapon took hold of the golden throne of Kiev, galloped as a wild beast at midnight from Belgorod, swathed himself in the blue mist, rent asunder his bonds into 3 parts, opened wide the gates of Novgorod, shattered the glory of Yaroslav, and galloped as a wolf from the Duduka to the Neminga. On the Neminga, the sheaves are laid out with heads, men threshed with flails and hedgerows. On the barn floor, they spread out life, they winnow the soul from the body. On the blood-stained Neminga, the banks were sown with bane, sown with the bones of the sons of Russia. Holy shit, is there anything more metal than werewolves? But my point being, the characteristics of werewolfism were once part of epic heroes. They were strong as bulls and they couldn't be hurt with weapons, or they were wizards shattering gates and sowing the banks of rivers with Russian bones. But then Ireland and Scandinavia and Kiev got all Christian, and the gods of the Norsemen, the Celts, and the Kievians became Christian devils. So a spiritual connection with a wolf, believed to be a frequent familiar of the devil, became a sign of evil. Where the Norsemen considered a blessing of Odin, it became an evil power or a curse. The magic of Veslav the Sorcerer could only come from evil. Sure, some of you might be like, hey, wasn't Veslav a Christian? Dude, it was the 11th century in Polotsk, and Veslav was part of the Rurik dynasty. I'm not going to get into it, but the short answer is that during Veslav's life, Christianity was young in Plosk and Kiev and had a shallow root. Even so, it provides a glimpse of how Christianity worked to demonize the supposed sorcerer and werewolf. The Russian Primary Chronicle says that Vleslav died on Good Friday because it was Good Friday. Apparently, Jesus killed Veslav for his sins against God. The connection, however, between vampires and other kinds of reanimated corpses from before the Enlightenment is coincidental. Sure, there are revenants in Draugr, and the Lamia was a blood drinker, but so were some fairies. The origin of vampires, as we understand them, happened in southeastern Europe during the 17th century, and was probably due to people's misunderstandings about the processes of decomposition. Like the teeth of the dead seemed to grow as the gums receded, and the corpses' mouths filled with blood, which was really, their organs turning to goop. For reasons that are not clear, in the 18th century there was a spate of vampire panics in the Holy Roman Empire. Seriously, people were digging up bodies and staking them and burning them. It was crazy, and they didn't understand the process of decomposition of the acid-rich soil that some people were buried in. And of course, it was a confirmation bias. If a person's body decomposed naturally, they weren't a vampire. But if you dig up enough corpses, some of them are going to decompose in unusual ways, usually because of the kind of dirt in which they were buried. From that rather disgusting origin, English writers in the 19th century seized on the idea that a vampire was a suave dude. John Polidori invented Lord Ruthven in a story Vampire, with a Y, in the same Byronic contest where Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. I guess there was something in the air. Instead of being a disgusting decayed corpse, Polidori turned a vampire into a sex symbol. Ruthven was hot, seducing girls left and right, and all of this would be solidified by Bram Stoker and Dracula, of course. Which might be more history than anyone gives a damn about, but it is what it is. You do research and sometimes you talk like this. One of the things I find really interesting, though, is how vampirism has become a power fantasy in the way that werewolfism isn't, despite pre-modern werewolves being the cool ones with all the magic powers. Over the years, the power of vampires have grown and their weaknesses have diminished. Dracula in the novels is defeated by some guy, and he has so many weaknesses: sunlight, running water, crosses, garlic, the list goes on and on. Sure, he has some mysterious powers. He can influence the minds of crazy people, he can influence the weather, he has great, though not superhuman strength. In the novel, Renfield is physically stronger than Dracula, only losing that strength by making eye contact. Dracula's mind is stronger than Renfield's, but not his body. Now, though, it's just expected that vampires have strength that exceeds not only any person, but also any werewolf. They have supernatural speed, often moving so quickly they can't be seen, and superhuman sensory powers, often dramatic abilities to control people's minds. They can command beasts, and sometimes they're shapeshifters. They have tended to lose their weaknesses too. Many aren't fussed by sunlight, or at least less than the traditional vampire, which was totally immobile and helpless during daylight hours, and they aren't harmed or repelled by holy objects. Garlic is nothing to them, much less the stuff like being unable to cross running water or needing to sleep in the soil of their homeland. Their strengths have grown vast while their weaknesses have turned to a tiny dot, often leaving no weaknesses behind. In modern literature, being a vampire is usually pretty sweet. You're young, strong, and beautiful forever. Sign me up, am I right? The opposite happened to werewolves. They grew weaker and their vulnerabilities multiplied. They were no longer turning into a blue mist and ripping down city doors, or immune to fire and weapons. They made a great slaughter of their enemies. And their ability to change shape is limited to the nights of the full moon, and they gain vulnerabilities to silver and wolfsbane. Even when it's no longer strictly a curse, werewolfism is usually seen as one, and doesn't come with a growing list of supernatural powers. So back in the day, almost everyone would have thought it better to be a werewolf because of the powers they commanded, but today those powers are commanded by vampires. The power of vampirism came with Anne Rice, where there had been other books with vampire protagonists. In Rice's first vampire novel, Interview with the Vampire, was horror. She quickly pivoted toward modern urban fantasy. Interview with the Vampire's protagonist, Louis, was a vampire, but weak for his kind and at the mercy of forces beyond his control. Mostly in the person of the vile Lestat, but also in the society of incredibly powerful vampires that controlled their culture. Louis sees his condition as a curse and his story as one of tragedy. However, from there, the books shift from Louis' horror to Lestat's arrogance from the vampire Lestat forward. Lestat is gifted vampirism from pretty much the only ugly vampire in the series, called Magnus, a traditional name for a powerful wizard. Lestat represents the person who made a pact with magical powers and who does not see his fate as a punishment. From there, novel by novel, Lestat gets a laundry list of superpowers, eventually growing so strong that he can't kill himself by trying to fly into the sun. Yeah, no shit, that happened. While still affected by sunlight to some extent in Rice's novel, none of the other vampire weaknesses are there. However, the Lestat novels see the solidification of all the noteworthy tropes that people now assume about vampires. The most notable is the idea that older vampires are more powerful than younger ones, that, as they age, vampires grow in physical and magical prowess, the oldest being veritable gods. This narrative has shaped almost all subsequent vampire stories. Age equals power, eventually to the point of divine status. The oldest vampires are often literally gods with cults full of worshippers. Hell, I've used it myself. Nothing like that has happened with werewolves in the modern world, though the early medieval source material highly suggests a possible base for those stories. When you're blessed by Odin, yeah, that's a pretty solid base for cool supernatural powers and tons of literary agency. I think that the literary development of werewolves is in flux. Sometimes writers seem to want them to give spiritual powers and a connection to nature. They aren't willing to go all in with it. I also think that there are racist and classist elements at work to keep it from happening. While a vampire can be of any race, they tend not only to be white, very white, but to mirror the societal constructs created by Western Europeans and white Americans. They have a feudal-based society with a bunch of rich old white people on top of everyone else. Werewolves, on the other hand, are often people of color, with societal organizations based on people of color, clans, or tribes. Notably, of course, are the First Nations, which often populate werewolf fiction. And unless you're really going to do the research and write about it in a culturally sensitive and informed way, don't do it. It becomes a variant of the noble savage or the magical Negro that these primitive people have a special connection with nature and magic. Most of the time, it's offensive and lazy. Werewolves also tend to be poor. They do stuff like belong to biker gangs or live out in primitive compounds in the hills or trailer parks. Writers often emphasize their shabby living conditions. They smell, usually, and are often engaged in violent alcohol-fueled partying without restraint. And while vampires sort of struggle with controlling themselves, they are usually the masters of their emotion. Restraint is typical of the literary vampire, really. Vampires mostly don't even try to restrain themselves. If they fight with their bestial natures, they end up losing anyway, assuming they bother to fight it at all. That's what racist and classist people say about people of color and the poor. They can't control themselves and they're animals. It's a pretty loud dog whistle equating werewolfism with poverty, low status, and being a person of color. It's also literary revisionism, because the werewolves of the Middle Ages were almost always aristocrats, like Sigmund from the Volsunga saga, Cuchulainn, or Vislav the Sorcerer. Werewolves were typically rich and of high status. This is, I think, also the fault of the universal creature flicks of the early to mid-20th century. Dracula was portrayed as a count, of course, a nobleman, but Larry Talbot was a common person, and because of his condition, he becomes a homeless wanderer. Class anxiety has always been part of the story about cinematic werewolves, and in the US, class and race anxiety go hand in hand. So while vampires retain their essentially aristocratic, white character as written by early Anglophone vampire writers like Polidori and Stoker, the werewolves were made into poor wanderers, often people of color living in squalor. Man, I fucking hate racism and classism. I really do. And on a personal note, I'm pretty sick and tired of stories of vampire supremacy over werewolves. End vampiric tyranny. Werewolves of the world, rise up! You have nothing to lose but your chains. That's it for this edition of Writerly Talk. Clearly, I'm on the werewolf side here. I find them to be more interesting or at least less cliched than vampires. I'm Kit Bradley, and I hope you like this video, share it, and subscribe. If you want to talk about this, hit me up here or on Facebook or Twitter. And everyone take care of yourselves out there, and I'll be seeing you soon.